I'm Matt at Nexus Baseball, and this is episode 10 of the Tommy John Epidemic. This series is a YouTube read of content from the book Plague of the Gods, an outsider's perspective on baseball's Tommy John epidemic, which is available on Amazon. I decided to put this content on YouTube to make the material as accessible as possible. This series examines the science behind the most superhuman action the human body can produce, accelerating a baseball up to 100 miles per hour. The damage to so many professional careers due to the Tommy John epidemic has been devastating. It has caused the pain of surgery, the end of many careers, and damage to the ability of the sport to put its best product on the field. However, the damage sustained by professional baseball pales in comparison to that done to those attempting to join their ranks. For every professional pitcher making millions of dollars, there are thousands of children with big league dreams. As of 2017, there were over 15.5 million participants in all levels of baseball across the United States alone. Resultingly, there are millions of amateur pitchers as young as 7 years old looking to move up through the levels of Little League, to high school, college, and finally the pros. Almost in line with the explosion of Tommy John surgeries at the professional level since 2000, 57% of all Tommy John surgeries are now performed on teenagers between 15 and 19 years old, an increase of 343% from 2003 to 2014. Absolute injury numbers among amateur populations will usually outnumber those among professionals, given their much greater population. But what is startling is the rate of increase over such a short period of time. Clearly something has changed about how an amateur player participates in the sport as well. Dr. James Andrews of ASMI, the leading orthopedic surgeon performing UCL reconstructions in the country, estimates that he performed 1 or 2 procedures a year on high school kids in the late 1990s, whereas in comparison today, he performs 80 to 90 procedures a year. Likewise, while fewer than 50 players total had undergone the surgery in the mid-1980s, as many as 10,000 baseball players of all ages across the world have done so since. Just as with the professionals, the question becomes, what is causing this epidemic? And why has it expanded so greatly in children where it was so uncommon before? In many ways, the corresponding increase in injuries among children is unsurprising. While not professionals yet, baseball youth have always attempted to emulate their big league heroes in so many ways, big and small. They use the same terminology, they spit seeds the same way they do, and most importantly, they mimic their motions. It is common to see a kid pattern their batting stance or pitching motion directly after a big leaguer that they admire. Just as the pitchers of early baseball watched their peers and experimented with what seemed to be successful, the same process still applies to 21st century children, aided by new advances such as streaming games in high resolution as well as YouTube clips. Although often an imprecise approximation, the child's rendition of their hero's motion often includes very subtle cues and habits. This process of emulation makes it highly likely that the same mechanical flaws that may affect the big leaguers are now partly responsible for the large number of kids going under the knife as well. Aside from potentially the same mechanical issues, what has changed since 2000 that specifically applies to children? The first change that presents itself is a change in how high schoolers and college-age kids enter the pros: the draft. The amateur draft was first implemented in 1965 to create a structuralized system to bring young talent into the major league system. Prior to 1965, teams scouted players directly and offered them contracts as they saw appropriate. The result was that wealthy, big-market teams would stockpile talent and attempt to corner the market, both at the expense of smaller teams. This was also of detriment to the players they were stockpiling, many of whom never had an opportunity to prove themselves or play with the big league club that they had signed the contract with. To correct this, the draft was implemented, with teams picking players in reverse order of standings from the prior season, worst to best. The baseball draft is massive and currently consists of 40 rounds of 30 players each, one for each team, plus compensatory picks. This equates to over 1,200 players being drafted each year out of the millions that play amateur baseball. Baseball management benefits heavily from the system due to the high cost of free agent contracts. Drafted players that sign with the team that drafted them are required to play for that team for a minimum of 6 major league seasons at lower defined rates. Therefore, teams highly value their draft picks, as they are one of the best ways to accrue player value without paying market rates. Teams in the past would select players after sending out scouts to watch them play at a high school or collegiate level and evaluate their potential. Key factors would be the evaluation of their skills to see if they would translate up to professional baseball and how they performed in game situations. This is still the general process in 2019, but a key change occurred around the turn of the century in how pitchers are drafted. Around this time, scouts seemingly began to value player performance much less than potential when making their selections. They became less concerned with what a high school player's earned run average was, and more concerned with their arm strength. The rationale seems to have been that through the minor league system, they believed they could teach them the other elements of being a professional pitcher. This on the basis that velocity was, and still is, largely viewed as a more innate genetic talent, or at the very least, the most challenging element to teach or improve. The result is that players are encouraged to throw as hard as possible, as early as possible to even be looked at in the draft. Prospect pitchers are focusing much more than they ever have before on strength and conditioning and training to throw with maximum effort in order to be scouted. Only the hardest throwers are drafted, with teams looking to mold them into competent pitchers, playing the analytics that as velocity goes up, batting averages go down. This has made the radar gun the primary arbiter of a young pitcher's future in baseball. Soft-throwing pitchers that can paint the corners rarely even get a look, with the mid-90s on the fastball being now a commonplace goal. Buck Martinez, former player and commentator for the Toronto Blue Jays, discusses this fact in his book, Change-Up. Bemoaning that so many quality pitchers with lesser or still developing arms are being overlooked by the draft in favor of velocity, he writes that a prospect can't get drafted unless they throw gas. This has created a system in which there is immense pressure to throw as hard as possible, as early as possible, in order to have a shot at a future in the sport, regardless of if their arms are prepared for such intense stresses, particularly while a child is still growing and developing. This bias towards velocity could also be a contributing factor to the trend of yearly increases in fastball velocities in the major leagues. There are simply fewer and fewer draftees that throw less than 95 miles per hour. This trend combines with the monetary pressures of the draft to create a ticking time bomb. Even with 1,200 players drafted, the pressure to also be picked earlier is palpable. It is unlikely that a low draft pick will make their way into the major leagues, with players picked after the first couple hundred regarded as long shots, fodder to help future stars gain experience against in the minor leagues. After all, there are only 750 players playing Major League Baseball at any one time, 25 per team, of which there are approximately 350 pitchers. Successful baseball players often have long careers, leaving few vacancies for the over 1,200 new draftees each year to fill. High draftees, by comparison, are awarded large signing bonuses, sometimes reaching the millions of dollars for top prospects, as well as a fast track to the top. Whether the pressure to succeed comes from internal drive or often family influence, it creates tremendous pressure to do what it takes. In this case, that means throwing the baseball as hard and as often as possible, regardless of the consequences. Join me for episode 11 next week. Remember, if you like the content, please like and subscribe. Your support makes this work possible. Also, if you want to jump ahead, please consider picking up the book on Amazon from the link in the description below. See you next week.